Well, thank you very much for joining the seminar. We are happy to have this wonderful group of people. Today we had to modify our schedule, and then we are going to have the paper of Professor David Hunter, then a short paper by Constanza Bianchi. Then we are going to have a little break. And after that, we will have the response by Professor Caroline Humfress, and we will open the session. As we are going to have 3 speakers instead of 4, maybe the session could be a bit shorter, but I think this is not a problem for anyone. So, well, thank you very much. First of all, I have the pleasure to introduce Professor David Hunter. He is Margaret O'Brien Professor of Catholic Theology at the Theology Department of Boston College. He is author and editor of many books and articles. His research interests lie in the writing of Augustine, Ambrosiaster, Jerome, Ambrose, and other Latin writers. He has written extensively on marriage, celibacy, sexuality, and asceticism in ancient Christianity. He is very well known by his book on Jovinian, Marriage, Celibacy, and Heresy in Ancient Christianity by Oxford University Press. Now he's preparing a monograph on the origins of priestly celibacy, and is translating the Pauline commentaries of the Ambrosiaster. David Hunter is one of the main editors of the Brill Encyclopedia of Early Christianity, which is now online, but we hope that very soon will be published. And then thank you, David, for accepting our invitation. And now the mic is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Samuel. It's a great honor for me to be here addressing this audience. I was telling my students the other day, or our students, I should say, because the seminar was co-taught by Samuel Fernandez and myself. But I took over the second half of the class on the canons, and I mentioned that it seems like we're kind of in a golden age of scholarship regarding canons, and I noticed Professor Grauman is here. Of course, he's one of the major figures in this rebirth of interest in canons. Well, because I distributed my paper in advance, I'm not going to read it all. There are a couple of sections, particularly the second and third section towards the end, that I will be presenting. I'm just going to quickly summarize the first part of the paper, and since if you haven't read it yet, then you certainly have a copy that's available to you. After a brief introduction, I have a little section that overview of the canons of Nicaea and something about the council, and then I have a section. Again, I'll just summarize this briefly. As you know, my title is "Disputed Questions" on the canons of the Council of Nicaea. And I lay out 3 types of disputed questions. The first type being a question that was disputed at the time of the Council of Nicaea. And the example that I will be talking about briefly, just summarizing this part, is the question of the reception of schismatics or heretics, and the background question being whether they need to be baptized or rebaptized, depending on your perspective. But the 2 types of disputed questions that I'm going to focus on, and that I'll actually read the paper. The second type of disputed question is a question about the meaning of some of the terms in the canons of Nicaea, and I'm going to focus specifically on Canon 8, which deals with the reception of schismatics into the church, specifically clergy. But there's a word in there, digamoi, that is the twice married. And there is an ongoing dispute regarding the precise meaning of that term. So that will be the second, but the first major issue I'll deal with, but the second part of the paper. And then the third type of disputed question that I'm going to address, and again, will be part of the paper that I'll be reading, is very similar to the second, but it's not so much a disputed question about the meaning of a specific term like digamoi, but it's a disputed question about the intent of the canon overall. And in this case, I'll be looking at Canon 3 of the Council of Nicaea, which deals with the question of what sort of woman, which specific women are allowed to live in the households of clergy. So those are the three parts of the paper. As I said, I'm just going to summarize briefly the first part, the first disputed question pertaining to Canon 8, and then I'll read actually the portions of the paper on the second and third type of disputed question. Well, the first disputed question then has to do with the rebaptism or baptism of schismatics and heretics. And I spent a good bit of the paper on page 3, page 4, going into some of the background of that. That is the dispute that arose in the middle of the 3rd century. First of all, around the question of the lapsi, the lapsed Christians, and the issue that's you find especially in the letters of Cyprian and North African councils, and that is the question of what to do with so many Christians who lapsed in various ways in different degrees during the persecution of Decius. So I go into some of the background of that. But that's simply to get to the question of rebaptism and reception of schismatics. And because there were Christians, particularly in the Church of Rome, such as Novatian, who had rejected the possibility of penance for the lapsed, this led to divisions. And again, I don't need to go into all of the details of that. I think it would take us a little bit off. The paper, again, pages 3 and 4, goes into that. The basic upshot is that Novatian, a presbyter in Rome, had been elected bishop as a rival to Cornelius. Cyprian in North Africa and the North African bishops supported Cornelius. But then the question gets raised, and this is the one that's specifically being dealt with in the Nicene canon, and that is the question of whether these members of Novatian's community, for example, if they want to join the mainstream church, whether in Rome or whether in North Africa, what's the status of their baptism within a schismatic community? And at this point, I'm sure most of you are very much aware, the unanimity that had existed between Cyprian and Cornelius over the question of the lapsed did not continue. That is to say, on the question of receiving the those who had been baptized in separated communities, the new bishop of Rome, Stephen, and Cyprian disagreed rather strongly over the question of rebaptism. So it's at this point I am going to start reading on this first disputed question. And then let me lead rather naturally into the second of the third question. Well, the breach between Cyprian and Stephen gradually became more hostile, but it remained unresolved. That is to say, does not seem to have developed into a full-blown schism of its own, but the question remained on the agenda, at least in the Western Church, on into the early 4th century. Cyprian's view of baptism and the theology of the Church that supported it continued to dominate North African Christianity, reinforced no doubt by his status as a martyr. And it's going to find new advocates, of course, in the Donatists. And in the case of the Donatists, their rigorous views echoed those of Novatian, but their ecclesiology and their refusal to acknowledge the possibility of the possession of the Spirit in communities led by lapsed clergy, their ecclesiology reproduced that of Cyprian. Well, when Constantine gained control of the Western Empire in 312, he immediately had to face appeals from a group of North African Christians, who later become identified as Donatists, regarding a disputed election of the bishop Caecilianus of Carthage. Don't need to go into all the details of the Donatists, the origins of the Donatist controversy, but the significant point for where we're going with the canon, first of the Council of Arles, but later of the Council of Nicaea, is that Constantine first decides to convey the matter to Sylvester, the Bishop of Rome, and then later, when the Donatists do not accept the rejection of their claim, Constantine again refers the matter to a synod at Arles in 314. Well, the canons of the Synod of Arles, and this is the earliest synod in Gaul that whose records are preserved, states the following: concerning the Africans, because they use their own special law in that they practice rebaptism, it is resolved that if any come to the church from heresy, they question him on the creed, and if they consider him to have been baptized into the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, let him only receive the laying on of hands, so that he may receive the Holy Spirit. But if when questioned he does not solemnly confess the Trinity, this Trinity, let him be baptized. Well, it's clear, convoked by Constantine, the side of the Roman Church in the ongoing dispute between Rome and Carthage, and it instructs the Africans to adhere to the Roman usage. Now, this raises a number of questions that I'm just going to touch on fairly briefly. First of all, and this pertains also to the later Canon 8 of Council of Nicaea that I'll read in a moment. It's worth noting that among the signatories of the Canon of Arles was the Bishop of Carthage, Caecilianus. He was present at the conference in Arles, most likely to answer Donatist charges against him. Caecilianus then, by signing on to the canons of Arles, adopted the Roman position rather than his own North African tradition. Now, this poses a series of questions, I think mostly can't be answered. Had he become sincerely convinced of the rightness of the Roman position on rebaptism and abandoned Cyprian's ecclesiology, or did he simply see the handwriting on the wall and accede to the will of the emperor, which I suspect had become clear by that point? Or was it the result of some kind of quid pro quo, that is, an exchange of his own exoneration for approving the position on rebaptism presented by the bishops at Arles. And it's significant, I think, or at least worth keeping in mind, that Caecilianus was also present at Nicaea and signed on to the canon there. In any case, this leads into the topic of rebaptism, and as it was articulated at the Council of Nicaea in Canon 8. So I'm going to read the canon now. Concerning those who have given themselves the name of pure ones, katharoi, and who from time to time come over publicly to the Catholic and Apostolic Church, this holy and great synod decrees that they may remain among the clergy after receiving an imposition of hands. But before all this, it is fitting that they give a profession in writing, en graphos, that they will accept and follow the decrees of the Catholic Church, namely that they will be in communion with those who have entered into second marriages, digamois, which will be the subject of part 2, and with those who have lapsed in time of persecution, and for whom a period of penance has been fixed and an occasion for reconciliation allotted, so as in all things to follow the decrees of the Catholic and Apostolic Church. Well, there are several features of this canon that are noteworthy, and that suggest it was a response to an ongoing disputed question in North Africa and perhaps elsewhere after the Council of Arles. First, there's a development between Arles and Nicaea. The Nicene canon is concerned not just with converts from Novatianism, the pure ones in general, but specifically with the clergy. The canon continues with detailed directions on how to integrate Novatianist bishops and presbyters into communities where a bishop and presbyter already existed. If, as I suggested or speculated above, Bishop Caecilianus of Carthage had to return to his see and promote a practice on rebaptism or baptism and a practice of admitting converts that ran counter to the North African tradition inherited from Cyprian, it makes sense that there may have been some opposition to the full integration of these Novatianist clergy into Catholic communities. We might further speculate that the additional prescriptions presented by the Council of Nicaea, namely that these former Novatianist clergy subscribe in writing to Catholic practices on second marriage and reconciliation of lapsed Christians, that it would have been an effort to ensure that the newly converted clergy had fully abandoned Novatianist rigorism. In other words, those who describe themselves as the Puritans had to conform to the Catholic ecclesiology that admitted into the church persons who were not always entirely pure. It's very interesting, and it's a question kind of in the background here that will emerge a little into the foreground, and that is the question of, even though the Canon 8 seems to be addressing primarily the pure ones, that is, and these have been identified as Novatianist, there's no explicit reference to either to the Donatists or to the Meletian-schism. And the conflict, eventually the Council of Nicaea is going to address a letter to bishops in Egypt, entirely about the reconciliation of Meletian clergy into the church. They are accepted back as bishops and presbyters, kind of subordinate to the existing ones, and they can even advance to becoming bishop in churches once the existing bishop is gone. But it's curious, and it's a question I'm not sure how to answer, why the council itself addresses only Novatianists and not expressly Donatists or Meletians, even though later they will. And that's something that might be worth discussing. Move on to disputed question 2, that is the meaning of digamoi, which appears in Canon 8. I've just noted that Canon 8 of the Council specifies that the pure ones, the katharoi, had to agree to accept communion with lapsed Christians who had undergone penance and with digamoi, that is, Christians who had been married more than once. In the second case, the disputed question refers to modern discussions, contemporary discussions over the precise meaning of the term digamoi. Does it refer to Christians who had married for a second time after the death of a spouse, or does it refer to Christians who had divorced and remarried, perhaps because of adultery committed by one of the spouses? This question is not easy to answer, and it also lands us in the middle of a contentious debate or disputed question within contemporary Roman Catholicism. I'm going to digress here briefly into a kind of personal anecdote or autobiographical note, but that illustrates some of the contemporary concerns. In the fall of 2013, about 1 year before the opening of the 2 synods, Roman Catholic Synods and the Family, I received an email. I was on sabbatical in Budapest at the time, and I received an email from a Spanish priest living in Rome who asked me for my opinion about the meaning of digamoi in Canon 8 of Nicaea. I later learned that this priest, Jose Granados, who teaches at the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family in Rome, that he was also a consultor for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith at the Vatican. And he was already preparing for the synod that was going to open the following year. And it was anticipated that the synods, they were held in 2014, 2015, that the synods were going to address the question of modifying contemporary Roman Catholic policies on divorced and remarried Catholics. Well, I had to admit to Father Granados that I hadn't really thought much about the meaning of digamos there. I recommended to him the book by Henri Cruzel, The Church in the Primitive Church in the Face of Divorce. I thought that was likely to be a reliable guide. But it became clear to me over the next year or so that this was a very contentious contemporary question. The following summer, so right before the synods began, the somewhat conservative journal Communio, published an English translation of an older article by Cruzel called Divorce and Remarriage in the Early Church. It had originally appeared in French in 76. And this translation of Cruzel's article appeared with articles by Granados and David Schindler and others. And as I see it, these publications and several others that appeared the summer of 2014 were really a kind of a preemptive strike at the Vatican and at Cardinal Casper, who had been endorsed by Pope Francis, Casper had been advocating for a modification of the church's traditional discipline. Well, I had to acknowledge to Father Granados that I hadn't really thought much about the question, but having been made aware of my own deficiency, in subsequent years, I tried to remedy this and to engage more directly the question of divorce and remarriage in the early church. And I've published a couple of articles about that. So let me offer a few thoughts here on the word digamoi in Canon 8 and its possible significance within the context of the canon itself. First of all, one has to state the obvious, and that is that the canon itself is not about providing a ruling on divorce and remarriage. It's concerned only with the incorporation of former Novatianist clergy into the Catholic communion. In that context, then, the presence of digamoi is mentioned, and they are required, that is, the Novatianist or former Novatianist clerics are required to attest that they will be in communion with digamois, as well as with those who lapsed and underwent penance. Now, the position of Henri Cruzel is that digamoi referred only to those who were married again after the death of a spouse, and not to those who had remarried after divorce. And so he argues that Canon 8 reflects the penitential discipline that was imposed only on those who had remarried after the death of a spouse and not divorce. He takes a kind of absolutist position on the question of divorce and remarried. A rather different interpretation of of Nicaea's Canon 8 has been offered by the Italian scholar Giovanni Ceretti in a variety of publications, but also in a small book that he published again right before the two synods on the family. Ceretti has consistently argued that remarriage after divorce was treated by most bishops as a lapse akin to adultery, that is, as a sin that required penitential discipline, but one which ultimately could lead to a restoration of full communion in the church. And this latest publication, which appeared in 2015, reiterates this theme, and then he also links it to Cardinal Casper's proposal that something like a penitential process be created in the Catholic Church for the divorced and remarried. But what do I think digamoi means? Well, first, I'd say there's nothing in the word itself that requires it be limited to those who had remarried, limited only to those who had remarried after the death of a spouse. The word itself simply means twice married, without prejudice to the question of the reason for the remarriage or the condition under which the people were remarried. Liddell Scott lexicon even lists definitions such as married to two people, that is bigamy, or adulterous as equivalents to digamoi. The Bauer-Arndt Gingrich Greek English lexicon of the New Testament and other early Christian literature provides an example of a usage akin to trigamoi that refers to women who have left their husbands and married 2 or 3 times. Both of these lexical entries suggest that the term could accommodate persons who had entered into a second marriage after divorce, as well as those who had remarried after the death of a spouse had rendered them single. And it's not clear to me that the church or church leaders always sharply distinguished the two cases, the two conditions for remarriage. A second consideration, and here is where I would take a position and have in some recent work against Cruzel. I don't agree that the prior Christian tradition was unambiguous on the absolute prohibition of a second marriage after divorce. Obviously, if that were the case, then digamoi would only apply to those who had remarried after the death of a spouse. But if the prior tradition was not so uniform, then there's a greater possibility that the word digamoi refers to Christians who had divorced and remarried, but then also were in the process of undergoing some kind of ecclesiastical penance, even while their first spouses were alive. I have dealt with this elsewhere, and I have to say there's a marvelous article by Pierre Notin responding to Cruzel's book, and I think he's demonstrated, some others have demonstrated too, that the earlier tradition was more diverse on the question. And we can talk more about that. In any case, I think it remains a disputed question, but I'm inclined to think digamoi can have the broader meaning, include divorced and remarried. The third disputed question regards the cohabitation of clergy and the broader question, which may or may not lie behind it, that is clerical marriage. There is a canon, Canon 3, which refers to those women who are allowed to live in the house of a bishop, presbyter, or deacon. I'll read the canon. This great synod absolutely forbids a presbyter or a bishop, a presbyter, or a deacon, or any of the clergy, to keep a woman who has been brought in to live with him, with the exception, of course, of his mother, or sister, or aunt, or of any person who is above suspicion. Now, on its surface, the intent of the canon is clear. It prohibits unrelated women from living in the household of a bishop or other member of the clergy. It seems to refer to the well-known phenomenon of the femines subintroductae, that is the practice of male and female ascetics sharing a common household, which was mentioned repeatedly by church officials in late antiquity. The disputed question in this case is whether or not lawfully wedded wives are included in the category of women who were not allowed to live in the clerical household. Of course, the canon only mentions those who are explicitly allowed, but it does not mention wives. Now, this question arises because the wives are not mentioned, and not surprisingly, especially in the light of the later history of clerical celibacy and sexual continence, especially in the Western Church, it has sometimes been argued that the canon implies a clerical household that's entirely free of wives and may even imply a requirement of celibacy. As was the case with the twice married or the digamoi, the assumptions that historians have about the earlier history shape their interpretations of the Nicene canons. For example, there are several scholars, Roman Catholic scholars, within the past few decades who have argued that a rule of perpetual sexual abstinence for the higher clergy was universally observed and dates back to the apostolic period. This argument is found in the writings of Jesuit Christian Cocchini, Stefan Haid, most recently a German priest living and teaching in Rome, and a former prefect of the Vatican Library, Cardinal Alphonse Maria Stickler. Cocchini, Haid, and Stickler have all argued that behind Canon 3 is the long-standing rule of clerical celibacy. Well, a full-scale the issue of clerical celibacy or continence, but I think the arguments of Hyde and the others are problematic. First of all, there's no explicit evidence of such a requirement prior to the late 4th century, and it first appears in the decretal letters of Damasus and Siricius. It's mentioned by Ambrosiaster and Ambrose. The earlier evidence of a canonical requirement used to be Canon 33 of the Synod of Elvira. But as I understand it, there's been quite a lot of writing, especially by Spanish-speaking scholars, on the authenticity of the Canons of Elvira, and I'm quite convinced, especially by the work of Joseph Viela, that the 80 or 81 canons attributed to Elvira are a compilation of canons from a variety of different places. He actually argues that Canon 33 reflects the late 4th century development, and that it could be from the 5th century or or beyond. I think this argument is supported by the fact that Pope Siricius, or Bishop Siricius, who is one of the earliest proponents of the sexual continence requirement, he can cite the Nicene Canon on the issue of unrelated women, but he does not cite it to support his view on sexual continence. And so it seems that to Siricius, the Nicene Canon actually referred to the unmarried ascetics living together rather than being a ban on clerical marriage. Also, in the Canons of Neo-Caesarea, this isn't in my text, but I noticed recently that Canon 19 of the Council of Neo-Caesarea, which took place shortly before Nicaea and which has some influence on Nicaea, Canon 19 is mostly about lapsed virgins, but it mentions in passing that, of course, unmarried women should not live with the clergy. So that's a kind of indirect support that this would be the purpose of this ruling in Canon 3, not clerical celibacy. My position here, I'm following others, Roger Grisson, the Archbishop Peter, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Louis Lier, I think, namely that the Nicene Canon had only in mind unmarried clergy, and that unmarried clergy were restricted on the kinds of women who could live with them, but that it simply wasn't addressing the married clergy. Okay, well, I have a brief conclusion, and it'll be just in another minute or so. I think one aim of this paper, by focusing on disputed questions, that is, questions that both raised by the canons and by contemporary issues, is to make the point that the canons of Nicaea, as I think the canonical tradition in general in the early church, deserves to be much better known and studied. Canons of synods provide unique glimpses into the daily life and issues facing early Christian communities, even if their rulings are often prescriptive rather than descriptive or idealistic. I would like to conclude then by mentioning some of the issues present in the canons that I have not touched on in my presentation, but which could serve as the basis for further studies. Canon 18, for example, ruled that deacons should not distribute communion to presbyters, nor should they receive communion before the bishop, nor should they be allowed to sit among the presbyters. This ruling about the behavior of the deacons is echoed in several other synodal collections, and it points to a significant issue regarding, I think, tensions among the clerical orders, and especially perhaps rivalry between presbyters and deacons. The very first canon of Nicaea dealt with the question of castration, self-imposed or involuntary. It would be fascinating to explore just how common the phenomenon of castration or self-castration was, and why it was a matter of concern to the bishops at Nicaea. And then lastly, I would like to note that there's an entire category of canonical rulings that were repeatedly ignored or gradually discarded by the wider church. An example of the former would be the prohibition of transferring clergy from place to place, especially transfer of bishops from their original sees to other churches. An example of the latter would be, that is, ones that were discarded, would be Canon 5, which ruled that each province should hold a synod twice a year, one in the fall and one prior to and the other prior to Advent, or it's got to be prior to Easter. The aim of the pre-Lenten synod, according to Canon 5, was to ensure, I quote, that all pettiness, micropsychia, might be set aside, and that a pure gift might be offered to God. In an age when the Roman Catholic communion is gradually rediscovering synodality, the synod just ended last week, the canons of Nicaea might actually prove to be relevant to Christian life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David, for the presentation. It is fascinating how it is possible to say something and so many questions arise from the canons. After the break and after we are going to have a good deal of time for discussion. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Constanza Bianchi. She is junior fellow at the Fondazione per le scienze religiose of Bologna. She studied at La Sapienza and at Bologna with Alberto Camplani, who is here in this meeting. Her research interests are women in Christian late antiquity and the Christian canonical collections. This year, by the beginning of this year, she successfully defended her thesis on the canonical collection in its Coptic tradition and translation, with the supervising of Alberto Camplani. She has published some articles in journals and edited books, and we expect the publication of her thesis. Now, thank you for accepting our invitation, and the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Samuel. And I was saying before, I hope my hearing me? No? Sorry, can you hear me?
Now, yes.
Sorry, okay, yeah, because now it is very dark outside and the weather is not really stable. So I hope to manage. So I will start sharing my screen if I can.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Can you see it? Yeah?
Yes, again on the canons of Nicaea.
Yeah. So I will start the presentation. Yeah, and then I will start. Okay. Yeah, here we are. So this brief paper today will focus on the transmission of the Nicene canons into the Coptic translations. I will keep it concise to allow room for debate afterwards. And to begin with, I will briefly discuss the, sorry, I don't know if it's, okay, yeah, the manuscripts which transmit these canons. The first manuscript is Codex Monbi-EF, as catalogued by Tito Orlandi in his project CMCL, Corpus de Manoscritti Copti Letterari, or CLM 359, as newly classified in the Coptic Literary Manuscript System, directed by Paola Buzzi. This is a reconstructed manuscript that was dismembered, with its leaves being sold separately and now preserved in various institutions around the world, in particular in Egypt, France, Italy, and Egypt. Codex Monbi-EF transmits the so-called Corpus Canonum, the first canonical collection produced in Antioch in the latter part of the 1st century. Within Monbi-EF, there are also other texts, many of which are in some way related to the Council of Nicaea. We can refer to this set of works as a Nicene dossier. However, we won't delve deeply into these other works in this paper. Codex Monbi-EF comes from the White Monastery, one of the most important monasteries in Egypt, and dates back to 1002-1003. We know the precise date of the manuscript creation thanks to the colophon, which gives also other details about the manuscript history. The canons of Nicaea preserved in this codex include the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th canons. and these canons are found in the leaves preserved in the Vatican Library. These pages have not preserved the original pagination number, and as a result, we cannot be certain about their position in the manuscript, the original position in the manuscript. It is possible to speculate that they were placed, as it happens in the standard Corpus Canonum, right before the canons of the Council of Ancyra. However, it is more likely that they were placed in the middle of the Nicene dossier that we mentioned before. So the second witness of the Nicene canons in Coptic is Codex Monbft, again according Orlandi's catalogation system, or also identified as CLM 393. In this case as well, we have a reconstructed manuscript with the folia of this codex preserved in France and Germany. The reconstruction and also the contents of this manuscript are still subject of discussion among Coptologists. The state of preservation of Codex Monbft is poor. We can confirm for sure that also Monbft transmits the Corpus Canonum, possibly also along with other works related to the Council of Nicaea, so another kind of Nicene dossier. This codex too comes from the White Monastery and dates back to the 10th, 11th century as determined through a paleographical analysis. In this case, the preserved canons are from 2 to 8. Then there is a lacuna in the manuscript, a leaf is missing, and is followed by canons 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 17. Here the sequence of the canons is interrupted because of a lacuna. These canons are found in the leaves preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris and in the Staatsbibliothek in Berlin. The textual situation here is quite complex, with significant changes in the numbering and division of the Nicene canons. Now I will focus my attention on the translation of the canons that were the subject of David Anser's presentation in order to shed some light on the situation in the Coptic tradition. So here we are. The third canon of Nicaea in its Coptic version, transmitted in its entirety only by Codex Monbft, while in the other codex we have only the title, reads as follows. The Great Synod rejected those who bring in with them or have sisters, and they in Coptic they use sneu and schime, to live with them, or those who have female partners, shbere. It is not fitting for a bishop or a presbyter or a deacon, or to put it briefly, one who is a member of the clergy, to have a female partner with him as a sister, and to be partners living together, except for his mother or his sister, or his mother's sister, or his father's sister. For these are the ones who will be able to stay away from any suspicion. As we know, the Greek version of this canon uses the term suneisaktos, while the Coptic text is much more explicit about the types of women with whom a clergyman cannot share the same household where he stays, a sister or a female partner. This version of the canon emphasizes that the synod not only forbids bringing these women with them, but also states that the members of the clergy cannot live together with this kind of women. In my opinion, it is quite clear that in this version that, as also stated by Hunter, the primary focus of this canon is not centered on the celibacy or the marital status of the clergy members. Instead, the Coptic text underscores the different types of relationships or cohabitation scenarios that should be avoided between a member of the clergy and a woman. Then the Coptic text version of the third canon continues in a similar way to the Greek one, with the exception of 2 minor details. The Coptic text provides a slightly more detailed specification of family relations compared to the Greek version. The Greek term theia is rendered in Coptic as his mother's sister and his father's sister. And the second difference is that the Coptic version omits the specification of any other person. The canon concludes by asserting that the women mentioned above, and not any other person, are the only ones beyond any possible suspicion. So, while it is conceivable that these additional details were inserted by the Coptic translator, we should also consider an alternative scenario, another hypothesis, in which the Greek text used by the translator differed from the conventional or standard Greek canon. In this case, the Coptic translator may have faithfully represented the nuances and the variations found in the specific Greek source text, which could have been either a localized or modified version of the canon or a more archaic form of the Greek text. This raises the intriguing possibility that the differences in the Coptic rendition may reflect not just the translator's interpretation, but also some kind of idiosyncrasies in the source material available to them and to us. Now, this is the Greek 8th canon, but I will skip to the Coptic. Okay, this canon, the 8th canon of Nicaea in Coptic, is seamlessly connected to the 7th canon, and it's transmitted as part of the series under the number 7. Nevertheless, my focus will be solely on the portion of text pertaining to the 8th canon. The preservation of this text poses some challenges in the terms of reconstruction, primarily due to the poor condition of the leaf, rendering certain sections unreadable. The text in question reads as follows: if they wish to make their entrance in the universal church, they should renounce to their heresy. For it has been decided by the Great Holy Synod that those who receive the laying on of hands and belong again to the clergy, let them first confess. We will, and then here we have the first lacuna, in the hope of the confession of the Universal and Apostolic Church in writing. They will, and here we have the second lacuna, with those who have taken a second wife and with those who have fallen during the persecution, these for whom a period of penance has been established. If a bishop of theirs wishes to make his entrance in the Universal Church, the bishop should receive him, and he keeps the dignity of the presbyterate, unless the bishop of the city wishes to attribute to him the honor of the name of the episcopate, and any scandal is not occurring. Finally, here we have the third lacuna, but I think it's something like this occurs, however, only in the name, being removed from the duties, practical activities of the bishop, and being subject to the bishop of the city. Otherwise, there would be counted 2 bishops in the cities, as we mentioned before. Upon initial examination, a distinction becomes apparent between the Greek text and the Coptic version. The Coptic rendition highlights that if one of the poor ones wishes to be received into the Universal Church, he must openly renounce and reject his heresy. This specific declaration is absent, is lacking in the Greek text. Next, there is a reference to the laying on of hands and the subsequent retention of their status within the clergy, mirroring the Greek text. The middle section is somewhat challenging, as 2 verbs are missing due to the damage on the leaf. One noteworthy observation is that the text appears to feature direct speech in the first person plural, which is not present in the Greek version. In this direct speech, the only passage that is clear pertains to the confession of the Universal and Apostolic Church. This passage appears to be related to the Greek section in which the canon discusses the doctrines of the Church to which the converts must adhere. As we proceed, we come across the section dealing with the koinonia, with those who have married twice and individuals who faltered during times of persecution. Here the Coptic text closely parallels the Greek, providing no additional insights to clarify the status of these remarried individuals. The Coptic canon states the period of penance as the Greek counterpart, but the reference to the need for repentance is made explicit through the use of the term metanoi. Then the text omits the rules concerning the reintegration of the clergy in general, possibly due to an error of the copyist, and focuses on the issues of the reintegration of the bishops of the poor ones. In the Coptic text, it's very clear that the bishop of the city must receive the converted bishop, but the latter will retain only the rank of presbyter. It is also specified that the bishop of the city has the possibility to attribute the honor of the bishop's title to the converted one. An interesting addition in the Coptic text is that in order to maintain this concession, there should be no obstacle or scandalon in Coptic on the part of the people. This detail is absent and is lacking in the Greek counterpart. It is possible that the Coptic version stresses out the process of readmission might have included some form of inspection to facilitate this reintegration. The canon proceeds with a resolute declaration that the converted bishop will retain only the title, literally the name, but he will be relieved of all the duties and responsibilities associated with the episcopate. This is exactly what we can read in the statement concerning the integration of the Melitian clergy in the letter of the Synod in Nicaea to the Egyptian, which has been considered spurious by Henry Pietras. The text reads as follows, I quote here, "It decreed that he might remain in his own city without any authority to nominate or ordain, and that he was not show himself for this purpose in the country or in another city, and that he was to retain the bare name of his office." Additionally, in the Coptic text of the canon, the bishop of the converted bishop, he is required to be obedient to the bishop of the city. These two clarifications are not present in the Greek counterpart. It is possible that also the Greek canon presented a similar specification to that one. The Coptic text ends here stating, otherwise there would be counted 2 bishops in the city, as we mentioned before. That corresponds to the Greek text. But in the Coptic version, it is no reference to the possibility of providing a role as chorepiscopus or presbyter for the converted bishop, as it was instead stated in the Greek. As mentioned earlier, in some cases, the Coptic text might offer a lecture that is more faithful to the original Greek than the standard Greek text that we are familiar with. This cannot be asserted for every difference observed and spotted today, but I would like to provide one final example from the Corpus Canonum in Coptic related to this potentiality that it must be taken into consideration. The 25th canon of the Council of Antioch regarding the administration of ecclesiastical assets. In this canon, the Greek version asserts that if a member of the clergy diverts the affairs of the church for its personal profit, the consequence will be as follows, in such a way that the resources of the church were diminished. And it's a strange consequence for this kind of action. The Coptic version states a different consequence for such actions, namely, by these kinds of people, the rest of the church is harmed at the same time. The Coptic version, in this case, aligns and agrees with the Syriac tradition, as noted by Cohen, and with the 2 Latin versions of Dionysus. This alignment may not be attributed to a deliberate alteration of the Greek version present in three different traditions, but more probably to a common Greek archetype. So I would conclude here, and I would just like to conclude by emphasizing the importance of examining and taking into account these minor traditions to broaden our perspective on the canonical literature of the late antique Mediterranean region. So thank you for your attention, and yeah, I stop here.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Constanza. We could hear your whole presentation, and then now we are going to have a little break, about 5 minutes, and then we can take a coffee, drink a coffee or something like that. And in 5 minutes we start again with the response by Caroline Humfress. Thank you. We are all in, and then well, now I have the pleasure to introduce Professor Caroline Humfress. She's professor of medieval history at the School of History of the University of St Andrews, Scotland. She has published widely on ancient, late antique and early medieval law and religion. Her research interests are legal history and legal practice, Roman law and anthropology, and religious and cultural history in late antiquity. She is author and editor of a long list of books and articles. I wish to highlight Orthodoxy and the Courts in Late Antiquity, Oxford University Press, 2007, because it's closely related to our topic. And most recently, she has edited the Cambridge Comparative History of Ancient Law. We thank you once again, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm excited because I literally just got the email from Cambridge University Press giving me the schedule for publication for the Cambridge Comparative History of Ancient Law. But that's another topic. So thank you very much indeed, both to Professor Fernandez and Professor Heil for inviting me to give this response, and also just for putting on this absolutely wonderful multi-year series on the Council of Nicaea. I feel like at every session we are presented with riches, and it's a genuine pleasure to hopefully contribute to that. Also, warm thanks to David, Professor Hunter, and Constanza, Dr. Bianchi, for such genuinely rich and interesting papers. And I think that both your papers, as we can all agree, prove that the Nicene Canons do indeed reward careful scrutiny, and they certainly deserve to be better known. So I very much hope that in the discussion that follows, we'll explore many of the substantive, important questions that David and Constanza have raised. By way of response, I would like to focus on one broader aspect of the Nicene Canons and their textual transmission. So this isn't at all in the expectation that this is what we will end up discussing, but more by way of perhaps placing the first two papers in some kind of context. First part of my response I have called Timelines and Hermeneutical Circles. So I don't know if you have, Samuel, the handout, if you could drop it into the chat. It's just one page, and it literally just gives you a couple of the bibliographical references that I'm going to refer to. So first part of my response, Timelines and Hermeneutical Circles. Second part of my response, if I have time, Refinus of Aquileia and the Canons of Nicaea. So firstly, Timelines and Hermeneutical Circles. So I thought it might just be worth briefly stressing again that there is, of course, no comprehensive critical edition of the Nicene Canons that takes all textual witnesses into account. And that is, of course, one reason why the work that Constanza and others are doing is so crucially important. There are scholarly debates over how the canons came to be compiled and by whom. And of course, Sarah Parvis has made a very important contribution to that debate. In addition to studies of their complex manuscript transmission, and again, Constanza's presentation today, I think, has shown us how looking at the Coptic transmission, the Coptic manuscripts, doesn't necessarily just tell us about the Nicene canons in the context of the Coptic Church, but also might tell us about the Nicene canons themselves. In canonical collections, as I suspect most people know, but again, I think it's worth just pointing it out, the Nicene canons usually directly follow the apostolic canons, i.e. the Nicene canons come before the synodical canons that come from earlier councils. So before Ancyra 314, before Neo-Caesarea 315, 319. This ordering brings me to the first part of my response on timelines and hermeneutical circles. In his now classic 1998 study, thank you, Samuel, the German scholar Heinz Omer, his Canon Ecclesiasticos, you'll see it referenced on the handout, he demonstrates that the term canones is not used to refer to synodal decrees until the 330s and the Council of Antioch. Omer points out that when the term is used before 330 CE, it is intended to designate, as Omer puts it himself, the sum of all that is authoritative and normative in the Church. What we today refer to as the Canons of Nicaea were understood at the time, and this is a quotation from Kinzig, as synodal fixations of the canon valid in the Church, which respond to certain concrete challenges. So in other words, if we want to understand the Canons of Nicaea as the participants of the Council in 325 CE would probably have thought of them, we need to think first in terms of the canon itself, i.e. the living corpus of evangelical and apostolic norms, written and unwritten. Everything that is authoritative and normative exists within this living canon, but as new concrete challenges and specific issues arrive, new concrete and specific solutions need to be reasoned out. This is the sense of canon that I think we can see in the last sentence of Nicene Canon 1, the first sentence of Nicene Canon 2, the first sentence of Canon 5, the last sentence of Canon 6, twice in Canon 9, the first sentence of Canon 10, the first sentence of Canon 13, the first sentence of Canon 15, the first sentence of Canon 16, and the first and last sentences of Canon 18. So I think, Omer's point is proved very neatly by looking at the Nicene canons, even though he doesn't do that really himself. According to this pre-330s understanding then, the Canons of Nicaea are synodal fixations of the canon valid in the Church, which respond to the concrete challenges faced by the bishops who assembled in 325 CE. As David's paper has brilliantly highlighted for us, the most numerous challenges that demanded responses in 325 seem to have related directly to the clergy, either, as David puts it, matters of clerical discipline or matters of church order and administration. So they seem to be the most urgent issues that presented themselves. So again, if we keep what I am calling a pre-330s understanding in mind, then David's first way of framing disputed questions fits, I think, perfectly within this understanding. David's first set of disputed questions are questions that previous synods had attempted to fix within the Church's living canon, but for one reason or another had to be reopened and re-reasoned out at Nicaea. So if we take the concrete example of Canon 8, the question of the rebaptism of schismatics and heretics, according to this pre-330s understanding, there were concrete and historically specific problems that had to be dealt with in 325 relating to rebaptism, as David's paper demonstrates. Hence, Canon 8 arrived at a synodal fixation of the living corpus of evangelical and apostolic norms, And of course, this is suggested by Tanner's reference to the specific apostolic canons relating to Canon 8. So that's on page 9, footnote 1 of the PDF that Samuel pre-circulated. Of course, Canon 8 also had to take into account previous attempts at synodal fixations in response to similar problems, and this is suggested by Tanner's reference to the canons from Ancyra and Neo-Caesarea and in the same footnote. So as I hope is clear, this process that I'm describing does not involve reasoning out in terms of a linear timeline. So it's not about what ought to be agreed in 325, then relates back to what was agreed in 351, 315, 319, and then back again to 314, back again to 305, etc. Rather, I think that this pre-330s understanding involves reasoning out within a circle. So if we imagine a circle whose boundary lines are literally formed by the living corpus of evangelical and apostolic norms, the idea is that every council which meets and looks at a very specific question, question that's urgent in 325, must stay within the bounds of the circle. And all of the other concrete decisions that have been made are also within the bounds of that circle, so they can be taken into account. So I'd like to turn now briefly to David's second and third ways to understand disputed questions. The second type of disputed questions that David gives us relates to modern scholarly disputes over the precise meaning of a term in one of the canons. The third type, just as a reminder, relates to the question of the overall meaning or intention of a canon of Nicaea. I'll take each in turn, focusing more on the second type. So if we turn to the second type and David's discussion of Canon 8 and the word digamos, he asks, does it refer to Christians who had married for a second time after the death of a spouse, or does it refer to Christians who had divorced and remarried? So again, working out from Ohm, I think that David's question can itself be understood in two senses. First, there is what I'm going to term the historical question. Which concrete challenge or challenges, plural, did Canon 8 respond to in 325? And I think David's paper has given us an excellent account of what those concrete historical challenges may have been. Second, there is what I'm going to term the normative question. What normative value does Canon 8 have for future challenges? My point here is that almost pre-330s understanding of the term canon addresses the normative question in a very specific way. So if we all imagine that we are participants at Nicaea in 325, then we would expect that concrete challenges relating to the twice married would arise again in the future, but that these future questions would be resolved in turn by future synodal fixations of the canon. And these future synodal fixations would work from and with Canon 8 of the Council of Nicaea, because Canon 8 is a specific historical iteration of the canon, the living corpus. As David notes, there is nothing in the word digamoi that requires it to be limited to those who remarried after the death of a spouse. So if my suggestion has anything in it, I think this is precisely the point of Canon 8. This is what is important. In 325 CE, the bishops assembled did not intend Canon 8 to lay down a fixed rule for all time. Rather, it was intended to fix the correct solution from the living corpus of evangelical and apostolic norms in response to specific 325 CE challenges. So they had to get it right for 325, but the expectation wasn't that the solution in 325 would be therefore applicable when other issues arose to do with this particular topic in the future. But of course, when those issues are decided, they have to remain within the hermeneutical circle. The bishops assembled at Nicaea in 325 would have expected future councils to do the same. Now turn back to Ohm's 1998 study and think about what he argues in terms of what happened after the 330s. So Ohm's thesis is that from the 330s onwards in the Eastern Empire, he detects what he terms, and I quote, a substantial theological shift towards a church ruled by laws that were claimed to derive directly from apostolic decrees. Now, there has been a lot of debate about this, but I think in general, I agree with Omar. I think there is a shift in the 330s, and I think he's right. It happens in the Eastern Empire, and it takes a bit longer to happen over in the West. So for me, and I'm well aware here that I've been trained as a historian, and it's as a historian that I'm now going to speak. Having been trained as a historian, it's almost post-330s understanding of the canons that seems to underpin David's anecdote from 2013, and also possibly David's third way of understanding disputed questions. So if I put this probably a bit too bluntly for the sake of clarity, under this post-330s definition, Canon 8 establishes an ecclesiastical rule, a norm, a law, meant in a theological sense, lex, which is derived from an apostolic decree. Hence here, the word digamoi must have a specific, determined and determinable meaning if we are to arrive at the overall meaning or intention of Canon 8 of Nicaea. So I hope it's clear what's at stake here in terms of the pre-330s and the post-330s way of reasoning. Having spent the last 30 years or so studying different types of normative, including legal reasoning, I find Ohm's distinction between a pre-330s and a post-330s understanding of the Christian canon fascinating. Partly, this is because I think that it mirrors a fundamental shift within Roman law from jurisprudential hermeneutical circles to late Roman imperial legislative timelines. And I'm thinking here in particular of the Theodosian Code and indeed of Mark Letony's new book, and I think Mark's here today, The Christianization of Knowledge in Late Antiquity. In sort of 5 minutes or so, if I still have 5 minutes, if that's okay, Sebastian, I just want to give one concrete example of Ohm's post-330s approach via Rufinus of Aquileia. At this point, we now return to Rufinus and the post-330s Eastern approach to conciliar authority. In 402 or 403, Rufinus finished translating and updating Eusebius of Caesarea's ecclesiastical history, and this was in direct response to an explicit request from Chromatius of Aquileia. Chromatius wanted to use this newly translated text by Rufinus to rally the people of the region in the face of a threatened invasion from Alaric and the Goths. Hence, perhaps, the focus of Book 10 of Rufinus's extended text, namely, as Rufinus puts it, the ravaging of the church by its own people between 325 and 395. Partway through Book 10, Rufinus includes an epitome of the councils, the Canon of Nicaea, alongside a Latin translation of the Creed. This edition of the Creed and the translation, the epitome of the canons, are sandwiched by a telling set of narratives. So very briefly, in chapter 3, we are told a miraculous story of a pagan philosopher who converted to Christianity during the Nicene Council. Then we get a series of thumbnail sketches of distinguished delegates at the council, followed by an account of the debate concerning Arius's propositions and the relaying of the conciliar decision to Constantine. Rufinus then includes the Latin translation of the Creed and his summary of the 22 Nicene Canons. Immediately after the epitome of the Nicene decrees, Rufinus tells the story of the discovery of the true cross by Helena, Constantine's mother, thus neatly linking imperial and conciliar authority together and using each to bolster the other. As Rosamund McKitterick notes, however, later medieval scribes who were cut to copy Rufinus's history responded to the presence of the Creed and the summary of the Nicene Canons in different ways. So just one example. A very telling example comes in the manuscript Paris Bibliothèque Nationale, Latin 5500, folio 156V. This is an early 9th century manuscript. In this manuscript, the beginning of the first Nicene canon is preceded by the following sentence, and I translate. This sentence is written out in 2 lines of capital letters, and all of these capital letters are a full line high. Okay, we might just need someone to mute. Super, thank you. So we have this, imagine this manuscript, 9th century manuscript, just before the the epitome of the Nicene canons begin. We have this sentence written out in capital letters. They decree an edition that it is to be observed in all the churches. So this early 9th century Gallic scribe alerted his intended audience to the fact that the canons were of a different quality to the text that preceded and followed them. For the 9th century Gallic scribe, the Nicene canons laid down universal decrees that were to be observed in all the churches, and he literally told his intended audience about this with capital letters written in the full line of a text. The universal authority of this exerted Nicene canons had to be marked out from the other words contained in Rufinus's text. This, I think, is a logical extension of almost post-330s Christian legislative understanding of canonical authority. Regardless of whether we think there's anything in my contrasting this pre-330s, post-330s idea about conciliar authority, I just want to end by warmly thanking again Constanza and David for their papers. I think firstly, both of them prove the extent to which change in Christian doctrine and practice was possible and legitimate within the early church. And secondly, Constanza's paper in particular, and her encouragement for us to examine the minor traditions to broaden our perspective on the canonical literature, is something that I hope many new generations of scholars will take on board, so that we can finally perhaps produce a critical edition of the Nicene canons. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much for this insightful response to David and to Constanza. And now we have time for discussion, and then we have the first one. Please, if you, Pavel, if you can introduce yourself and then formulate the question.
No, I'm sorry. It was not a question. I'm sorry.
Ah, sorry. Okay. David, please.
Well, a question for Constanza. I mean, that was a wonderful, wonderful paper, and very exciting to see what the Coptic translation, particularly of Canon 3, has to offer, especially the way it is more explicit about the question of the female partners of the clergy. So I guess my question is there a way that you can determine how or whether the Coptic translation is based on a different Greek and an earlier Greek than what we currently have? I mean, I can imagine comparing it to other translations, to the Latin translations, for example, or Syriac translations, but you know, I mean, you suggest that it's possible that the Coptic had the original Greek behind it, but I mean, how can one determine that?
You're still muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. I was saying, I reply, or we collect question and then we answer. I don't know. I can reply.
Maybe you can answer now. Yeah.
Okay. So it's a difficult question because we have the easiest thing is to read this version in parallel with the other. So with the Syriac in particular and with the Latin. But sometimes it's clearer that it's a modification that comes from the Coptic translator. And I didn't say this, but for example, also the two tradition of the Nicene canons in Coptic, so the MONBF and MONBFT are probably two different traditions. So they are we have a small amount of canons that we can compare because we are from the 2nd to the 6th. But in these canons, we spot some differences between these two translations. And so it's probably two different, I have to say, two different Greek texts. But it's very difficult to determine if it's the translator that is just interpreting the text, or if it's the Greek text. But for example, for the Canon of Antioch, it's clear that it has been in the Greek, this kind of different consequence of the actions of the clergy, because it's not possible that we find this parallel in three different traditions, so the Syriac, the Latin, and the Coptic. So, but it's just very difficult to spot precisely if it's the translator or not. We have to be very cautious doing this. So I always tend to be very attentive and not just state something, because otherwise I will maybe be wrong. Yeah, sorry. It's not really an answer, but this is the situation in the Coptic tradition.
Just a quick follow-up to allude to something Caroline mentioned. I was really shocked when I started working on this material and learned that there really wasn't a critical edition of the Canons of Nicaea that takes into account the varied translation. I was very shocked. I think I read it in Weckworth's an essay of his. So it's a real lacuna in scholarship.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We have two persons. First of all, Thomas Grauman, and then Alberto Camplani. But Thomas, please.
I should like to add a little remark that in a way relates both to what Caroline just described, also referencing Rosamund McKittrick about what later people did with this, and also the questions raised by Canon 8 in both David Hunter's and Constanza Bianchi's discussion. So that in modern terms, that question, is this anything to do with celibacy? This question must have vexed people in antiquity already. I've just submitted for publication an article on a late 5th century collection, a dossier, you could say, using your term, on Nicene material, which reports a narrative that, as far as I know, is for the first time recorded in the Church History of Socrates. In that narrative, the well-known and famed holy man Paphnutius, an ascetic himself, dissuaded the bishops in Nicaea from proposing a specific ruling on clerical celibacy. To his mind, that was asking rather too much. And so the bishops, on his advice, wisely refrained from doing so. Now, this, of course, is reflective of Eastern practices, but it might also shed light on the question as to whether Canon 8 implied anything of the sort. Apparently not, if we wanted to follow this tradition that Paphnutius distinctly persuaded the bishops not to rule anything of the sort in the context of Nicaea. So later legislative interests that, as Caroline has pointed out, now in a way perhaps parallel to what Rufinus does, but differently, sort of adds narrative to sort of sandwich, to use your word again, the canons themselves by stories that shed light on what was allegedly meant or not meant. Yeah, that's probably more than I should have said already. I'll shut up now.
Just a quick response. Well, it's Canon 3, I think you're talking about, not Canon 8, but on possibility of celibacy. But yeah, the Paphnutius incident doesn't occur or isn't found until the 5th century. And there are a couple of articles by a Byzantinist, Winkelmann, I think it's Friedrich Winkelmann, who I think pretty successfully debunks the episode. There's, I mean, on several bases, that is on the issue of who is Paphnutius. Was there a confessor who was also a bishop? Was he actually present at Nicaea? And he goes through all of the evidence, all the possible Paphnutiuses, and basically Winkelmann determines that the story may have been circulating in 5th century Constantinople, may in fact be a reaction to what has been developing in the late 4th century in Rome regarding clerical sexual continence. But I think it's been fairly successfully debunked, which is unfortunate because it's a beautiful little story. And, the confessor Paphnutius with one eye and, having suffered in the persecution, argues that, marital relations are something good. It's something that one wishes were true, but I think it's problematic.
May I just come back to that? Is that allowed? Just one remark. I may not have expressed myself very well. Of course, this is an entirely fictional story. This is no historical information about Nicaea, but it is. I tried to suggest it is evidence for the ways in which later generations, and you placed it very nicely. I said Socrates is the first, to my knowledge, to report it. So that gives us the early 5th century and presumably Constantinople as an environment. How one might respond to perceived lack of precise definition at Nicaea by adding stories like these to perhaps address that issue. I was not suggesting for a moment that this was a sort of historical information that was reliable with Nicaea. I probably haven't said that very clearly, but this was how it was intended.
Okay, I thank you for that clarification, because I did misunderstand you. I thought you were suggesting it was true, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Then it does reflect what Caroline was saying in terms of the later use of Nicaea.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you very much. Now we have Alberto Camplani and then Uta Heil. You are muted. No, we cannot hear you. Uh-huh. I think you maybe you can chat you can write your we can give the word to Uta Heil, and in the meanwhile you can write your question, Alberto, because we are not hearing you.
Okay, so I just jump in and give you some time for writing or fixing your micro. Thank you very much for all these wonderful papers and responses. It was very interesting to hear more about the canons, and I'm lucky that we have decided to put canons on our schedule, and we think there is much to be done. And just a little remark to Canon 8, I think it's not possible actually right out of this canon to find an answer what digamoi actually are, because this is not in the view of those who wrote the canon. So it's more, the topic is about the pure ones, the Novatians, and including probably also the Meletians, and the clergy of them, and they can be accepted if they give in or get into communion with those who have undergone some penance. So, and I think second marriage and lapsed are just the two most disputed examples of those times. So it is those who have undergone some time of penance, and this is, of course, in the duty of the bishop to decide how long and what one person has to do, if lapsed or not, and married. And so this is the topic, and so either digamos in this sense or digamos in the other sense. Both persons have to do some kind of penance, and those from the Novatians or kataroi, they have just to accept those among their communing, because if they are accepted and they are in a way, as bishop, responsible also for the community, they have by themselves think about these penitential systems and so on. And so this is the topic, and I think this is only pars pro toto, two examples which are at those times mostly disputed. And so I think digamoi, it is not, it's maybe both ways to be understood. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I
just want to say I agree entirely with that. I think it does include both, and that clearly the purpose of the general purpose of the canon is not about divorce and remarriage or per se. It's about the katharoi being reintegrated. Yeah, and if I can say something, I think the interesting thing here is that we have one canon that regulates something, but at the same time is witness of another practice, which is and the canon is not intended to speak about this topic, but is a witness of a practice. Alberto, let's see whether now. Yeah, maybe. Let me see.
No, there is nothing in the chat. Perhaps, Alberto, you can write something in the chat so we get your topic.
Yeah. Well, by the way, and then I take advantage for a question. It's a question, well, the first part of the question is for David, and the second part for Caroline. It's about what can we know about the concrete situation that shaped the canons. That is, the sources do not provide the concrete context of and discussions that motivated the canons, at least in the case of Nicaea. And then what can we learn from the previous canonical tradition to shed some light on the canons of Nicaea? And the question for Caroline is, like, in a more general sense, if you can speak about this relationship between particular situations and then general rules, general laws, because in the canons we have the sense that these are very abstract and general rules, but we know that many times these rules comes from very particular situations.
Yeah, my response has to be brief on the concrete situation, because with the Council of Nicaea and the Canons of Nicaea, we don't have proceedings, that are written down. So we really don't know for certain. I think looking at previous canons, and I think we do have a little more evidence with the Cyprianic councils, the North African councils. My sense is, but again, it's somewhat speculative, is that the bishops gathered, and that before or informally they may have presented this or that issue as particularly problematic in their congregations, and that these were then brought to the assembly and discussed. We don't know how much debate there was. There seems to have been quite a bit at the North African synods, though most scholars doubt whether there was a lot of debate or discussion at Nicaea on the canons. But I think individual bishops brought their concerns, and again, from their local communities. And then how it was decided which issues to address, I really can't say. I'm not. That's not clear to me.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, I did have this sort of, I think, slightly crazy idea, but I don't think anyone else has done it. I might be wrong about this, so please feel free to correct me. So thinking about the concrete situation, I thought it would be interesting to actually go and look, because many years ago, I took all of the legislation that we know Constantine issued, throughout his entire rule, and I put it into chronological order. So I went back and had a look at what he was legislating about whilst the Council of Nicaea was meeting. And it's actually quite interesting. So he issues constitutions in June and July of 325 relating to tax payments, legal procedure, civic duties and obligations in North Africa, appeals from provincials to their governors. And then all of a sudden in September 325, we get this quite unique constitution where Constantine he's talking about how people can be free to bring whatever disputes they like to him and he'll judge them. And I think this echoes the rhetoric that we find in the Eusebius, the life of Constantine, because there's a shift in the Constantine, the imperial rhetoric in those letters. So if you look at the letters that are being issued just before the council and during the council, Constantine very much sets himself up as this kind of mediator, this, I am free, I'm available, I'll sort disputes out. Can't you just, and this constitution from September 325 actually states that I will hear everything, I will conduct an investigation. If the charge is proved, I myself will avenge myself. Then it goes on to say the highest divinity may be always propitious to me, i.e. God's going to help him out because he's doing this, and keep me unharmed, as I hope along with the res publica, we will all be most happy and flourishing. And I really do think that there is maybe a hitherto unmade connection between this Constantinian constitution coming hot on the heels of the Council of Nicaea and this kind of conciliatory language and this mediation language. If you look at the letters of Constantine after Nicaea, then you can see, especially to do with Eusebius and Antioch, and the question of whether Eusebius can translate the see or not, move to Antioch. The imperial rhetoric completely changes. It becomes very different. Constantine starts mentioning, rather than being a peaceful arbitrator of disputes, that letter about Antioch is, he's talking about what would be consonant with apostolic tradition, the need to maintain the apostolic rule of the church. So without wanting to speculate too much, I wonder whether Constantine, has gone to Nicaea, listened to what the bishops have been saying, and might just have learned something. And it's this idea of the apostolic rule, that he's taken away. So I think that's a very interesting idea. But your second, I think your real question to me was about this connection between the concrete and the universal. And maybe it's because I've spent most of my life working with Roman legal sources, but to my mind, it actually looks very similar, the way that it's meant to work. So I think it's rather than getting a rule and then reasoning out from the rule, you always start from the specifics on the ground, then you reason up to the rule and you try and work out which rule is actually applicable. So it may be that it's not one rule, it might be 2, 3, 4, 5 rules, as long as they're within the hermeneutical circle. So if you're a Roman lawyer, the hermeneutical circle is probably going to be your jurists, your jurisprudence, and your legislative texts from the emperors. If you're a bishop, it's going to be the apostolic canons, the canons of the church, the early church, etc., etc. So your rules are then, they're sort of almost elastic in a way. They're fixed, but you can do things with them. And the point is then to reason back down again and solve the concrete problem. So, and this is a sort of operation that you're expected to perform every time a concrete question presents itself. And that to me seems to be very different from the kind of, sort of legal reasoning that you start to appear later in the 4th century, I think, especially with the imperial codifications when I'm thinking about Roman law. So I don't know if that quite answers your question, Samuel, but that's what I would say.
Oh, thank you very much.
Caroline, just a comment. I think pointing to the role of the emperor at Nicaea makes a lot of sense. And it also is coherent with what he decided to do in 313, 314, in the case of the Donatist, and referring first to the Bishop of Rome. And then he decided to hear the appeal, but he referred it to the bishops. But he's taking a direct role. And so it kind of fits with that.
Yeah, it seems that Alberto Camplani's microphone is working. Is it? No. And then maybe David, you could read aloud in the chat is the text of Alberto. Oops. You are muted, David. Oops. No, you are still muted.
Okay, that's okay. He says, an important question was posed by Hunter at the beginning. Why does Canon 8 speak of the Katharoi and not the Meletians? One might think that the Katharoi are a widespread phenomenon in the Mediterranean, while the Donatists and Meletians are a phenomenon limited to one region, Latin Africa and Egypt. Thus, for one of the two regional phenomena, the council resorts to a letter. For the Donatists, the decisions taken before were probably sufficient. But I don't know if this can be a good answer. The question is probably more complex, that of understanding the function of the canons of the Council of Nicaea. What do they represent in the editorial history of the acts of the Council of Nicaea? Why don't we find in them decisions that we would have expected to find? And then he posted another observation for Constanza. I agree with her that the Coptic translation poses many problems and must be interpreted in a flexible way. It could preserve archaic elements, but also it could innovate. For example, the elimination of the mention of the chorepiscopi seems to me to correspond to the fact that they do not exist in Egypt. The omission is a way to make the canons more Egyptian.
Okay. Yep. I don't know if you have some remarks on.
I agree with Professor Campiani, of course. Also, Annick Martin stated that the chorepiscopus was not attested in Egypt. So it's very possible that this is an innovation and not something that was. It was more like the translator that decided to cut off a position that was difficult for them to, I don't know, fit in the hierarchy of Egyptian church. So yes, I think so. And this, if I can add something, in my study of the Corpus Canonum, it's one of the cases in which we can, I will say affirm, but not very, it's not sure, but it's more possible that the Egyptian translator just entering in the text, innovating with a change of a modification of position. For example, another case is in the Gangra Canons, where in Greek we have some kind of expression that means someone who cares for the church goods, something like this. And in Coptic we find oikonomos, because this role was well attested in Egypt since before than in the other parts of the empire. So basically the translator probably knows that this kind of person is called the oikonomos, and just change this expression to fit better the context. So just to give an example. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just a quick response to Professor Complani on the lack of mention of Donatists and Meletians in Canon 8. It occurred to me while Caroline was speaking about the role of Constantine, and if he saw himself as this mediator, it may have been more conciliatory not to bring up the local, the live and local issues in the canons, but to refer back to the katharoi, which, as Professor Complani said, are, you know, would have been more widespread.
Okay, Uta, you raised your hand.
No, I just wanted to read the company.
Okay. Maybe Xavier Morales could say something about Constantine, because he published an article about what Constantine learned, but of theology, not of canon law.
Yes, what I can say is that actually, I think that in Nicaea, Constantine was very was hearing to everybody, and he was aware of all the problems, all the solutions, and that, as I argumented in last year in a paper, he was able to introduce into his own convictions, theological convictions, but as Caroline Humfress also stated, perhaps also in his law practices and way of writing laws, he introduced what he had heard during the event. And every day I perceive more elements of what he could have heard and learned during the event in his letters and in his laws, and also in his other documents. So I would not be. I wasn't surprised when Caroline stated that Constantine could have modified his juridical writing before and after Nicaea.
Thank you. And by the way, I checked the Martin Wallralf edition of the Gelasius of Caesarea Ecclesiastical History, and Paphnutius, the story of Paphnutius is here, and then it's late 4th century, if this reconstruction is right, because it's very hypothetical, but I think that is very, the arguments to show which text is or was or not in this history are reliable. Mm-hmm.